So this is a real treat for me today where we have Dr. Rey Uail on the Soil Health Minute. And Ray, you've been working in cover crops for since 2000 and also in soil health for 40 years. And what's the most interesting thing that you've learned over that time?
Well, it's been a real journey, a real adventure. I was fortunate. I got my education. I began my education and grew up in Michigan. But I ended up doing my graduate work in Indiana and then in Virginia. And then moved to Maryland. And Maryland and Virginia and Kentucky have perfect climate for Ноу Тил. It really is easy there. And for cover crops. And so actually back in the 1970s, early 70s, when I was in graduate school, showing my age, we were doing cover crop research, Ноу Тил research, and Ноу Тил became a standard practice in Maryland. So by the early 80s, majority of farmers were using Ноу Тил. 75–80% of crops were planted Ноу Тил. It wasn't necessarily long term, but you did not see much bare soil. You wouldn't know what color the soil was, in other words. It was always covered with residue. And the cover crops sort of dropped out. I think that was because there were economic interests for herbicides and for the Ноу Тил system and machinery, but there wasn't much of a business behind the cover crops at the time, and they just sort of dropped out, which was a mistake. But my career and my work was with farmers who were doing Ноу Тил and with an interest in cover crops. We had a number of problems we had to deal with. And then we started having big environmental problems in water quality, just like in the dead zone in the bottom of the Mississippi and in the Great Lakes and Lake Erie and all that. But we ran into those problems 20 years earlier, 25 years earlier. I mean, the Chesapeake Bay, which is the world's greatest estuary. Baltimore used to be the oyster capital of the world, and fisheries and crabs and rockfish. It was just a wonderfully productive bay. It was dying. And in Maryland, farmers and fishermen live side by side because the bay runs right up through the middle of it. So your neighbors might be what we call watermen. They might be going out and making their living getting crabs off the bay in their boats while you're farming. So there's a real connection. You see that, hey, I'm messing up these guys' life because I'm polluting, once they made that connection. And so we really started some programs with neighboring states because the Chesapeake Bay runs all the way up through Pennsylvania and Delaware and all the way up to New York State. That's a little bit harder, to get farmers in Pennsylvania and New York to be concerned about what's happening downstream. But we had these pressures, and so we started doing things, I think, way ahead of the rest of the country. And one thing as I studied Ноу Тил and as I worked with farmers, and you see it happening, in the first couple of years, it's not so impressive. But when you look at fields that haven't seen any tillage for 30 or 40 years, and you look at what that soil system is like, it's much more like the natural system in the forest or in the prairie. And you realize what a mess we make of soil as a material, as a system, when we plow it. And you have to keep plowing it because you've turned it into this, if it's a clay soil and you're tilling it and it gets wet, you're bogged down, you can't do anything with it. You have these dinner bell soils like you have in the Red River Valley where you've got about 2 hours where you can till them and they're either too wet or too dry. None of that happens under natural conditions. That doesn't happen out in the prairie. And we can get back to that condition, and it makes farming so much easier and more effective and more profitable once you get to that condition. So it's really been a journey to see that.
So here in North Dakota, we talk a lot about picking a goal and then choosing your soil health building practices around that goal. And for a majority of the farmers here, it's erosion control. Is it nutrient leaching in your part of your neck of the woods, or is it erosion there as well?
Well, erosion is of course the first thing. If you lose the soil, you've lost. Game's over, right? So everything else is secondary to that. But we've pretty much controlled erosion. We have very little sediment now leaving our farms because there's almost no tillage. And once you stop tillage, and of course you have to leave the residue, it wasn't until the middle of the 20th century that we realized what really causes erosion is that raindrop impacting the soil. It's not an obvious thing. You think it's the water running off, but it's not. It's the raindrop impacting the soil. You've got to keep the soil covered and armored, and then you don't have erosion problems. And we have slopes. Parts of Maryland are flat like here, and slopes are very, very minor, but other parts are what you would think was a ski resort. I mean, real slopes, 10, 15% slopes, and we're growing crops on them. and they have. And you know, they've been farming for 300 years, and most of the soil is down off the land. So it's very dramatic.
So you've worked quite a bit with cereal rye and radish, and those are two of the most common cover crops we're using here in North Dakota. And so what's been the most fascinating things you've learned about a radish and what it does in the soil?
Well, let me mention cereal rye first. Cereal rye is the most common cover crop anywhere. It's so easy to grow. You can plant it late. It manages to survive the winter. You get some kind of cover. But it has some real downsides, right? It has some good things, but it has some real downsides. One is it ties up nitrogen.
Okay.
If you let it grow enough to add biomass to the soil, you're going to pay a price if you're trying to grow a corn crop into that, if it's a nitrogen-using crop. And so that's something that scares farmers. They don't want to see it grow very big, and so they kill it early. And then they don't get very much from the cover crop. And that's the most common cover crop in Maryland as well. In fact, we have a state program that subsidizes cover crops, and you get paid a little extra for growing rye because it is efficient at pulling up nitrogen. I was looking at that, and farmers really didn't like the rye, but they would use it because they were getting paid to do it. And I made a trip down to southern Brazil. So you go south of the equator, and you go far enough south in Brazil, and it starts to get cooler and cooler. And so the very southern part of Brazil has a climate very much like Maryland. And I was down there doing some soil health talks and visiting farms. And I would drive up the farm lane on a big farm, and you know how you drive up a farm lane here and you often see variety trial signs or herbicide signs from plots. This was in, I think it was 1999. And I drive up the lane, and there were these little signs, and they were cover crops. There were all these cover crop trials. I said, these guys are taking cover crops seriously. It's all no-till, because it is sloping land, and the Brazilians learned no-till from the Americans and ran with it and really made improvements in it and kept the cover crops in. And we've learned a lot about cover cropping, roller crimping. All of that is Brazilian technology. And I saw they were growing brassicas. I wasn't very familiar with these, but they said, oh, these are really good. They help with compaction. And they hadn't done the research on it, but they were quite popular. So I started a brassica research project when I got back around the year 2000. And we found that radishes and canola and rapeseed really could perform differently than other cover crops. And we were focusing on compaction. I just noticed the SARE interview survey of farmers using cover crops. What is the reason they're interested in cover crops? The number one thing is usually compaction. And that was the issue we had in Maryland. Maryland farmers, you can buy stuff out of a bag to cure most of your problems, but compaction is tough, right? And so that's a problem that people have. And so I said, well, if we can solve this with plants, we're going to really be ahead of the game, because we wanted to stick with no-till. But how do you solve the compaction problem? And that's when I started doing research on biodrilling, which is a really different way of solving compaction. So if you can get roots to grow down and leave channels, they create sort of superhighways through the soil that your crop roots will continue to follow. It's like an infrastructure. It's like building the interstate system. Those are going to be there pretty much forever if you don't mess them up with tillage. And so that's kind of what our objective was. And we tried a lot of different brassicas, and the radish really stood out in its ability to do this. Yeah.
I'm a huge fan. Obviously, I've read your Nature Property of Soils book, and I've also read a lot of your research articles. So thank you for bringing that information to our farmers here.
Oh, it's a great pleasure to be up here in North Dakota. I have to say that one of my most eye-opening experiences and inspiring experiences was about 10 years ago. I was invited to go to Bismarck, North Dakota. And I found out that Bismarck, North Dakota was really ground zero, epicenter of the cover crop no-till revolution. The farmers, some of the leading farmers there, and Jay Furman with the NRCS, were really doing fantastic things. And it was the first meeting that I'd been to, a big farmer meeting, where the farmers were given the talks. And that was just eye-opening and terrific. I thought that was just wonderful. That farmers were telling people what they were doing, and they had figured out solutions. And I was the only sort of academic person there. And that was great.
There's a lot to be learned from farmers.
Yeah, there is. A tremendous amount. Always learn from farmers, yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Ray. And
thank you for inviting me. It's great to meet you, too, because you've had a tremendous impact. I've seen your videos online, and I've heard from talking to farmers here, just the evening I've been here, what what a great rapport and what great respect they have for you, and you've really excited and inspired a lot of farmers.
Thank you.